join us today. Thank you, Maxine. Okay, we got it. All right. So again, welcome. My name is Lily Tsao, and I oversee alumni relations. And I am joined by my team members today. We have Bert Jacklich. Bert, if you want to give a wave. Hey, Bert. Maxine Fagioli. And also Kenzie Durham. Hey, Kenzie. And as your alumni relations team, we're here to create opportunities for you to connect and to engage with your fellow alumni, to build Fuller community, to connect and engage with Fuller and engage with the amazing faculty and leadership as we're doing today with our own Michaela O'Donnell. So we're excited to introduce you to a new book written by one of our very own alumni, Michaela O'Donnell, who is the executive director of the Dupree Center for Leadership and also assistant professor of marketplace leadership here at Fuller Seminary. She is very, very busy. So it boggles the mind how she has time to write a book. But she has, and we're excited about it. And the name of the book is Make Work Matter, which we all want to do. So I'll be interviewing Michaela to get a glimpse into her book and her inspiration for writing it. And along the way, we would love to have questions from you. So if you could just pop that into the chat, we will try to get to them during our interview with Michaela. And we'll also try to get to as many questions as possible. We know you must have questions, so please feel free to pop them in the chat. And so welcome, Michaela. Thank you so much for coming to talk with us today. And I wonder if we could just start by asking you a little bit about yourself and telling us your experience, your role here.
Yeah, well, thanks, Lily. It's good to be with you and everybody else here today. Yes, I am a Fuller alum. So, I don't know that I ever quite get it right. Am I an alumna, an alumni, something? Which, okay, all right. Bert's nodding. I've got Bert's approval. It's one of those two. So yes, I did a couple of degrees at Fuller, and I am still here. And if you would have asked me 10 years ago, will you be working at Fuller Seminary? I would have been like, absolutely not. Like, I will not be working at Fuller Seminary. And yet this is where God has sort of laid out the path for me. So like Lily said, I am currently the executive director of the Max Dupree Center for Leadership. And for those of you who don't know, or the Max Dupree Center is new to you, we are actually named after, you might guess, Max Dupree. And Max was longtime CEO of Herman Miller, which is a furniture company. And he was also longtime chairperson of the board at Fuller. And when people describe Max, what they say is that he kind of was who he was wherever he was. And that is kind of what we're about at the Dupree Center. Our focus is really on leaders who are in the marketplace, much like, Herman Miller or other companies, but who are living faithfully and asking questions about what does it mean to be a Christian in these spaces. So I've been in this executive director role for I think it's coming up on 6 months. And my goodness, the 6 months has flown. I was thinking, it's been 1 or 2. And no, I did the math. It's been 6. I was the senior director here at the Dupree Center for 3 years previously. Even before that, I am the co-owner, and managing producer of a company called Long Winter Media. That's a company that I started with my husband. I can actually tell you the story of that because it's kind of relevant of how this book came about. We started that about a decade ago after we both had gone to Fuller. I'm not very active in that company anymore because like Lily said, I am very busy. And so I sort of give lots of high fives and waves to other people who are doing good work there. So those are sort of my roles. Oh, I should also say I'm a mother. I've got 2 kids and one daughter who her birthday's at the end of October, and she would be unhappy if I reported anything other than she is 5 and 11/12 right now, and a son who is 2. So, and mothering is quite a bit of how I make sense of my work and calling. So that's me and my many roles.
Well, thanks, Michaela. It's fun to hear a little bit about you and your little ones.
Yeah.
So Make Work Matter. Tell us, what is that about? Who is it for?
Yeah.
And, what inspired you to write it?
Yeah, thanks for asking, Lily. You're right. Only I've come to believe that only a person who's like maybe just a little bit not well would undertake writing a book, because it is quite the process. And this is a book that in many ways is birthed out of my own experience. It's all the career advice and kind of deeper reflections I wish I would have had 10 or 15 years ago. To be quite honest, I wish I would have had it 5 years ago. And in some cases, I wish I would have had it 5 months ago. And so in that case, and I was somebody who really came of age and came of working age in a disrupted work landscape. Things were changing. How folks said things were going to be were not actually how they were. And I really felt like I didn't have the tools to navigate my own way forward. When I graduated and when I was kind of there trying to figure out what to do, quite literally, my husband and I were trying to figure out how to pay rent. We live in Los Angeles. The rent is not cheap. And we had just graduated seminary, both of us. And we were in the middle, it was 2010 and 11. And we're right in the thick of the Great Recession. And I don't know if I'm gonna go ahead and say this. I know I'm talking to a group of alum, but I realized firsthand that in that moment, in a recessed economy in Los Angeles, a theology degree was not a very marketable skill. People are like, well, that's cool that you can, make sense of the Bible, but how many words can you type a minute, Michaela? And that process of having to try to figure out what to do with my degree was disheartening. Dan and I come from a family of teachers and entrepreneurs. That's what we do. We big Irish Catholic families in the Midwest. And if you look and see what folks do for work, for paid work, most commonly, we teach people things and we start businesses. And so it was my sense in that moment, like, okay, Dan, we got to start a business. And Dan is a very good sport. And so he said, okay. And we started a business, and it was called Long Winter Media. And we were doing that for several years until eventually I kind of felt the pull, if you will, back to PhD studies. So I came back to Fuller to do a PhD in practical theology. So there I was running a business full time. And now I was a student full time. And then we learned that we were going to have our first kid. I was like, okay, even for me who likes to fill my dance card beyond full, this is too much. It's just too much. And I went to my mentor and I was like, I don't think I'm going to do the PhD anymore. And he said, see if you can figure out how to make work and school the same thing. And I was like, I don't understand what you mean. He's like, go figure out what I mean. And Lily, that little conversation right there is the beginning of Make Work Matter. So I went on and I did dissertation research on people who were like me, who had to navigate their way in a changing world and had kind of come out and done that successfully, distilled down different practices, attitudes, belief. And right about the time I was doing that, I ended up landing at the Dupree Center with my colleague, my former boss and now colleague, Mark Roberts, wonderful man, wonderful leader. And he said, would you like to try and turn all that fancy research and thinking into resources for real people? And I'm like, yeah, that sounds great. And so I spent the next couple of years doing that alongside a really gifted team at the Dupree Center. And it was all of that then led to this book. And so who is this book for? It's for people who are asking questions about the changing world of work. It's for people who are like, yeah, I get the idea of calling, but that hasn't totally played out like I expected it would. It's for people who crave meaning, which I think we're all wired to crave. And it's for people who are in transition. And, experts would say that we're in transition once every 12 to 18 months now. And so in that way, it's kind of for anybody that's feeling those things.
Yeah, so true, so true. So, in the context of a changing world and our changing selves, would you maybe then just give us a preview of the book content by describing that process of discovering meaningful work in a changing world?
Yeah, for sure. And by the way, if you have questions and you're like, that answer you gave, Michaela, I don't even understand what you're talking about. Like drop them in, and Lily and I would love to take those along the way. So please do be doing that. Yeah, I think that there's a lot of myths that are operative here. And one of those is that we ought to find what we're passionate about and then go and find paid work that lines up with that passion. And then we're going to be good. And God is going to be in that process. The issue is that for most people, especially people who are early on in career, who are in the middle of transition, who have faced some unexpected setbacks, maybe want to think about, kind of changing careers, it's actually not so easy just to name what you're passionate about. I mean, I think even if I ask that question, and I won't ask anybody to answer, but just think about it. Like, if I said Lily and Bert and Esther and Amy and Wayne and everybody else, what are you passionate about? That you might have some answer, and you might find yourself kind of reaching a bit. And that's because most of what we discover that we love to do comes through a lot of trying things out. And oh, that one kind of fit. That one kind of didn't. Oh, this context felt like a good fit, and this one didn't. And so the process to, kind of from a broad brushstroke perspective, the process to find meaningful work is much more day by day, on the way, and iterative than I think many of us want it to be, and or have, I'll say, been taught. But I'm not necessarily pointing the finger at anybody there saying, hey, this bad person or the church or the educational institutions taught us that. I think it's the mainstream narratives, right? So the process is much more iterative and involves a lot of different things. I'll name just a couple here. I described the research that I did. I asked people in that research, but Lily, since then, I've asked people these 4 questions a ton. And 4 questions are, and again, these are questions for you all. How have you learned to define success? How have you learned to define failure? What practices have moved you towards success? And what practices have helped you deal with failure? And I ask these questions to what I'll call objectively successful people. I ask these questions to people who are struggling. I ask these questions to people who are kind of all over the place in terms of thinking about their work. And one of the most interesting things that surfaces to the top, and as I've become convicted, is maybe the starting place of meaningful work in a changing world, is the practice of empathy. So it's much less, let's again discover what it is we are good at, and much more, how do we move toward other people? And the kind of empathy that I hear people talk about is not a manufactured kind of empathy. It's not the kind that's like, let me go conduct a research survey or a listening thing. Those things have their time and place, but it's something I've come to call practicing empathy along the way. And I'll give just an illustration for this, and then I'll bat it back to you, Lily. My best visual for this actually comes from the passage of the Good Samaritan. So you got, we all, and why? Because most of us, I say the Good Samaritan, that story. This is kind of Christianity 101, which is why I like using the story. You've got this person who's in dire need on the side of a road. He's really hurting. You got some people who walk by, and in this conversation, I don't want to address why they walk by, but then you got this other person who's also on this road, presumably en route from point A to point B. Like he's got an agenda, and yet he lets this person's needs interrupt him. He moves toward him. He moves towards saying, actually, what if this guy and I went and on our way together? What if, I put him on my donkey? Oh, he might be walking kind of slower, sort of a dangerous road. And oh, what if I've got some oil and wine and a little bit of money? And what if I use those on him? His empathy sparks imagination. It sparks some risk taking. And I think that it's hard to be interruptible in these days in our work, because we've got so much to do. But I am more and more convinced that the meaningful work we crave starts with that practice of practicing empathy along the way.
That's so thought-provoking and so stirring. So you're talking about empathy and and passion and calling, and sometimes we do think a passion is God's calling, and sometimes it is, and maybe sometimes it's not. Maybe it's a function of something else. But make work matter, as I understand it, is about discerning God's calling on each of our lives and what God is calling us to do. So, what does the Bible say about calling? Um, what does it say about calling, and what does it not say about
Yeah.
calling? Because
Yeah.
I know many times in my life I felt like, oh, God's calling me to do this, but maybe yes, maybe no. So what can you tell us about that?
Yeah, I think I'm just kind of taking a deep breath with you, Lily. I think calling is one of those words that has come to mean a lot of different things to a lot of different people. Some people get very excited about the word calling and they sense God's activity and God compelling them toward specific people or places. Other times the word comes with a lot of baggage, actually. Like, okay, we've been, the word calling has maybe even gone as far to be a source of manipulation in people's lives. And so I think it's just important to name up front that calling, we all come into the talking about calling through different lenses. And I think it's healthy. And I would encourage each of us on this call to ask yourself, like, are you comfortable with the word calling? If so, why? If you're not really comfortable with it, why? Um, and to go back to something else you said, I think God is in passion. Absolutely. What gets more problematic for me is when we equate and make calling and passion synonymous. Because then what it does is when we don't know what passion is or it feels muddy, then all of a sudden, do we not have calling? Like, is God not there? Right. And so it becomes too limited of a container for us. And I actually think another limited container is when we associate calling and work, calling and job, vocation and job. I think that's one of the strongest operative myths that's out there. And my colleagues, Paul Matsushima, Jerome Blanco, and I, multiple years ago at the Dupree Center, did a series on some of the myths of vocation. And this is one of the ones that we found that was actually pretty destructive and disruptive in an unhealthy way, is that calling and job were sort of associated. Why is that problematic? Because that's not, like, the Bible doesn't say that calling equals our paid job. That's not, you don't find that in the Bible. And so then you have to start to ask questions about, okay, well, what does the Bible say about calling? And it says a lot, and there's no way I could describe it all right here, but it's been helpful for me actually to think about calling sort of like a set of nesting dolls. So people sometimes talk about calling as this or this. It's an either or thing, but I think calling is actually much more of a layered reality. So in that innermost little doll is the call to belong to Jesus, right? This is Matthew 4, on the shores of the Sea of Galilee kind of stuff. I would say that the next layer out is God's invitation for us and commission to participate in redemption and reconciliation and restoration, often through means of love and sacrifice and justice. This is 2 Corinthians 5 stuff, right? Like, you're going to be ambassadors of this ministry of reconciliation. The next layer out, I like to go all the way back to Genesis here. And this is the call to create in loving service of those we're around. Lily, I encounter a ton of people who don't necessarily attach or feel comfortable putting the creative label on themselves. They're like, it's like a thing artists do, or that's like a thing other people do. But it's Genesis 1. God's like, made people in the image of God, and then said, like, fill the earth. And that's just recovering that, I think, is a lot of the work of adulthood and faith. So that's the third one out. And then once you got those nested in, you got the call to belong and the call to participate in redemption, the call to create, then you get to this outermost thing that I like to call the call to particulars. So Lily, you said, sometimes I feel like God has called me here or there, or to someone, or to a place, maybe even to a job, but that is a way to express all that's nested within, not the sum total of what calling is. It's just a way to, if we have just the particulars, then everything else is pretty hollow, actually. And we need all those layers built in. And of course, we see instances, God calling Moses, and Esther, even in a different channel, the mother Mary. So there's evidence of those particular calls all throughout scripture.
Wow. I'm thinking on that one.
That's a lot to think about there.
It is a lot to think about.
Yeah.
And I am thinking that that those are that with us here today are thinking are newly on that as
Yeah.
well. But I also want to ask you, the world of work is ever changing.
Yeah.
And it just feels like it's changing at an accelerated pace. So as pondering and thinking and writing out this book, what are some of the most challenging aspects of work these days? And as Christians, how do we in particular, as Christians, overcome these challenges?
Yeah, that's a great question. I actually think this is a great place to invite some chat in. I've got some things to say here, but even before I do, okay, so introverts, don't worry, nobody's gonna have to be on blast. I always like to give that. I'm a bit of an introvert myself in that way, but think about it. Think about your own work, what you do, whether you've changed jobs in the last year or you had a period of not working or whatever else. Think about one way that your work changed in the last, let's say, 18 months. Okay, just think about that for a second. What is one way, even if you're not doing paid work, right? Think about all the work you do in your community, around your family and or your house. There's lots of layers of this. Think about a way that your work changed in the last 18 months, and then drop like 2 or 3 words that symbolize that in the chat. And while you're doing that, I'm going to talk a little bit about the things that I've noticed. So think about how your work's changed and drop a few words in the chat. Okay, Lily, so as part of my work at the Dupree Center, I talk a lot to groups of people like this. This is a thing I do. And 3 years ago, I used to walk into a room of people and I would say something like, y'all, the world of work is changing. And I would kind of announce it to them, right? And when I would do that, I would see their shoulders kind of like relax, and they'd be like, yeah, it is changing. Lily, I don't think that I've announced to anybody in the last year that their work is changing. We can see stuff coming in right here, right? People working remotely, having to focus more on short-term work, people getting new jobs, people recentering their work around really critical things like racial justice, right? Moving, yeah, right. And even just, and this one, yeah, this one that C has put here, I think is really critical. Some of us have been in these moves for a while. It's just become more normal for everybody else to see what we do in telecommuting and or otherwise as more normal. So I'm not announcing to anybody. You're throwing some great things in the chat. Certainly where we work has changed. Not for everybody. And there's some really interesting socioeconomic divides here. I saw an article a couple of weeks ago. It's like Amazon is forever having its employees work remotely. And it's like, okay, but which employees? What about the ones that are packing boxes and driving trucks? Like I certainly saw the Amazon truck driver this morning in my neighborhood, like he's not working remotely. So I think we even need to be careful about how we're talking about some of these shifts. And in the working remotely one, I think that we're going to see a widening divide, and we're going to see it play out along socioeconomic and class lines. So where we work, I think kind of how we work. I mean, how many of you were on active Zoom calls regularly 2 years ago? Maybe some of us, but not. Yeah. Okay. So Debbie, you're the leader in Zoom. You're the leader in this space. You be the Zoom tutor for all of us who are still catching up. But for many of us, adapting to how to relate to one another and connect through screens and pick up on social and verbal cues, that's a totally different layer of work than we were doing a couple of years ago. It's requiring new muscles. And then I think sometimes what we're working on. So somebody here mentioned centering, centering racial justice. There have been people doing that work for a while, and certainly wouldn't want to suggest anything otherwise. But racial justice has been woven into many of our purviews and our rhythms in ways that it, hasn't previously. So the where, the how, and the what. And so the questions really, as Christians, are like, okay, well, how do we make sense of calling, and how do we make sense of our work when everything's changing so much? And it's my sense. I actually think that Christians can respond distinctly here. And I think that our story is one that's predicated. I think a lot about the move between Friday, Saturday, Sunday, right? Good Friday to Easter Sunday. And the very best things that we point to in our faith that happen on Easter Sunday, the hallelujahs, the new life, all the light, are only possible because we've made our way through the waiting and we've experienced the loss and heartache of Friday. And because of the resurrection and that arc, like, we have the gift of resilience. And resilience, not just by me, this is now scholars way beyond me who do this in ways that I don't. They would say that resilience is one of the number one skills of people in a changing world of work. And so I would say, as Christians, we have a distinct lens that, the what and the how and the where and the who of our work is changing. And we're experiencing all the loss that comes with that and noticing new opportunity as well. We are grafted into a story that gifts us with resilience.
I love that word resilience.
Mm.
Yeah, I love that word. And so as we're looking at the world of work, and as I see it, everything is just sort of intensified and is moving at a faster pace, and even working remotely, I feel like everything is exponentially more time driven, and there's just it's just intense, and maybe that's counter to kind of the thought of remote working, but to me it feels like everything is more intense. And so how does the kind of hustle of today's mindset, that hustle, how does that mindset work against advancement? What are some of the better ways to embrace that fast pace, the intensity of this quickly changing and evolving work world?
Yeah, I think your word intense is really good, Lily. I noticed in the chat a few additional words: shocking and challenging,
Mhm.
right? Just kind of like
Mhm.
this nature of being always on. I think there's a couple layers here. There's been a provocative series of articles that have come out of the Atlantic and the New York Times that have made the case that as an American culture, we idolize work in such a way that we're like, this is the place that we're going to get our significance. This is the place where we're going to understand our identity. I mean, think about when you meet somebody new, what's one of the first questions you ask them, right? Like, oh, what do you do? Right. I've been trying to reorient that question. I'm still a little clumsy at it, but I'm like, oh, like, where are you? Or what do you do for fun? And you can feel that it's not, when I do that, you can feel it's not socially the norm, because it's so wired in to start with the question of what do you do? And the calling stuff, right? We decided that work is the container for calling. And so there's a bit of a implicit thing there that's like, okay, if work is where we get our meaning, and if it's where our calling plays out, then more of it is probably a good thing, right? And that's where you get this like hustle and this, kind of work at all cost, and we're sort of going. And that's kind of the internal stuff. Then there's a lot of external forces here, and it's like, and without pointing to anything specific, there are a lot of systems that are profit at all costs, are trying to survive, again, at the cost of individuals who work in those places, that are operating on kind of the pillars of systemic racism and sexism, and therefore are working really well for some people and not well for other people at all. And especially folks that those systems aren't working for are feeling like they have to work twice as hard. And there's just a bunch of things that contribute to these feelings of hustle. And so you might not be surprised to hear that I both struggle with that myself. And I'm like, that's not really what I think we should be doing here. So I say I struggle with it myself because I don't want to give the implication that I've got all this figured out. And for me, this is actually where the book of Exodus has been very helpful. Now, I will, if I'm honest, I gravitate towards the New Testament. I love the parables of Jesus. i.e. the Good Samaritan. But I honestly think that God's been inviting me into the Old Testament over the last couple of years, and specifically the book of Exodus more recently. Now, what do I mean by the book of Exodus? I'm thinking about God rescuing the enslaved Israelites and delivering them to the promised land. And along the way, setting up the 10 commandments, of which we get Sabbath and some things that come from Sabbath. So Pharaoh's kingdom is, again, it's one in which the Israelites are literally enslaved. They're exploited. They're taken advantage of. And Pharaoh is, motivated by greed and by anxiousness. And, basically says, like, if we don't work the Israelites, they're going to grow in number and they're going to take us over. There's just all this anxiety that goes into it. And so as the Israelites are delivered from captivity and God sets up sort of a new rhythm, right? God's like, yeah, you're gonna work because work is good. Work comes in Genesis 1 before sin. So I wouldn't want to make the case that work is, purely a result of sin. But there's also going to be a different rhythm to God's kingdom than there is to Pharaoh's kingdom. And it's one in which there is work and there is rest, right? And I think that living as people who are part of God's kingdom is really complicated today, because it's not like we're like, okay, cool, let's just sort of move away from all the Pharaoh-like systems at play, right? Again, profit at all costs, systemic racism, sexism, on and on. We're living amidst multiple kingdoms. We really are living amidst multiple kingdoms. And so sometimes rest is like literally holy resistance to the Pharaoh-like forces that would say, like, you got to keep going at all costs. You got to hustle, Michaela. And that's not always identified in like a person or a boss. It's these larger narratives at play. Because Sabbath is one of those things that, again, sort of Christianity 101, and yet it's not always a thing that we're able to access, or it's not, equitable for a variety of people, or we know it's a good thing, but we don't really do it. And so getting in rhythm with God's kingdom, I think, has been for me, that's, and I can feel when I'm out of sync, right? So for me, that's been when I felt like, okay, this hustle mindset that would say, grind it out at all costs, and whatever you achieve was worth whatever it took along the way, is actually not a mark of the kingdom of God. And God's like, actually, you're going to stop and remember that I'm God and I'm doing things, and you get to be a part of that. And I welcome you to be part of that, but you are not God. So I think that there's a rewiring of rhythm here that's long, slow, hard work, Lily.
So interesting, because yes, so in the midst of that, right, the intensity, the hustle, we're also seeing a record number of folks leaving their jobs these days, right? In fact, there's a phenomenon, right, that's been called, that this time has been called the Great Resignation. And we see that, right? I was just reading an article today, the numbers of people that are leaving their jobs, and therefore we have shortages in so many industries, right? The dock workers, the drivers, the servers, you name it, flight attendants, and all in all of these industries. So what do you make of that? And what insight can you give us with your work?
Yeah, that's really good. The Great Resignation. I think that it's sort of the culminating phenomenon after, for the last however many years, let's say 10, you could Google what percentage of people don't like their job or their boss or are disengaged. And at any given point, you would have somewhere between 40 and 80%. And the Great Resignation in some ways feels like a manifestation of people being able to do something about it, right? We're in a changing economy. Someone gave the analogy the other day. They're like, yeah, what's happening in the economy right now feels like, I'm from LA. They're like, it feels like there was a wreck on the 405 like 3 hours ago. And like the ripple effects are all still coming to me. And I'm like, yeah, that's what it feels like. Like there was a car crash, in this version, in the car crash, everybody's fine. There was a car crash 3 hours up ahead and all the ripple effects are coming our way. And so I think the Great Resignation is part of that. And I've been asked the question, like, should Christians participate in the Great Resignation? Should we all just should we do that? Is that part of a mark of the kingdom of God? And I think it's complicated and I think it's contextual. I really do. But let me say just a couple of things. One, I think that when we're part of systems that, without trying to demonize particular corporations or organizations too much, but that feel like they've got those Pharaoh-like forces, right? They're exploitive and they're anxious and they're greedy and they're not treating people well. I think that there's a time and a place and a moment for healthy dissent. I really do. And I think that is part of what it means to be the people of God, is to be able to align, and that the economy doesn't always give us that opportunity. A lot of times it doesn't. And most of the times that's a very privileged conversation to be able to say, let me change jobs and let me do this and that. But many of the industries you just named are, hourly workers, some of which are making minimum wage and aren't necessarily in the most privileged of positions. And yet we're seeing opportunity for mobility. So I think, yeah, like there's a time and a place. On the other hand, and this is where it's contextual, I think it can be really good and holy work to be part of redeeming broken systems and to be part of solutions, and knowing when is an opportunity for one and when is an opportunity for the other. That's not easy. And that takes discernment, and usually discernment in the context of others and in the context of community. So I would say it's a complicated phenomenon, and individual responses are pretty contextual. But yeah, how interesting that we're in this period called the Great Resignation.
Yeah. So we have a comment here in the chat. So much less personal connection with colleagues, difficult to work on creativity and formation when life can be reduced to Zoom tasks in a compressed timeline. Wonder if we will lose capacities in empathy, communication, and open and creative disagreement that births new ways of being and living into vocation.
Oh, that's such a great comment, Robert.
Yeah.
I'm kind of with you where, I've got some curiosities about all that informal space. So when I read what you're talking about, Robert, I'm thinking about all the informal space that exists around regularly scheduled meetings or activities or tasks. I'm thinking about, when Bert and I used to, quite literally, when Bert and I used to run into each other in the office, and Bert's like, hey, I got this person I think you should talk to. Would we have had that exchange if we hadn't passed by each other in the office? Like, I don't know. So there's all of these incidental, informal moments that I think we're at risk of losing, to use Robert's word. And I have to admit, I feel sad about that. There is a sadness there. And you say, I wonder if we're going to lose capacities in empathy and communication. That's where I think we've got to kind of be intentional. And just as much as we can't plan out, this and that, like, okay, what does it look like to, notice a colleague in a Zoom meeting that feels a little more withdrawn, or you feel like, oh gosh, they're like really distracted. Are they maybe overloaded, or are they, do they have something going on? Should I reach out? And one thing I do, particularly with empathy, is I encourage, this now happens, we lead some groups called Road Ahead groups at the Dupree Center. And it is like people are working through vocational transition, and it's a 6-week experience. It's pretty cool. And one of the things that we do in this is that we have people think about how they might practice empathy along the way. And what we have them do is they make a list. And so this is something you could do after we get off today. Make a list of everybody that you encounter in your work in a week. Now expand it to a month. Some of us have 5 people, some of us have 35 people, right? We have some more informal communications, and literally write the names of those people down. And then kind of go through a process where you ask God, like, okay, help me narrow this list down a little bit. Like, help me narrow it down to 3 people that I might consider moving toward. And then so you got this list that goes from maybe 10 to 3 or 20 to 3. And then when you've got 3, you sort of hone in on 1, and you're like, okay, you circle 1 name. Like, who do I want to intentionally move toward this week? And you write that name down, and you have that name in front of you. And what that does is it starts to alert you to their square in a Zoom meeting or the email that they sent you. And it starts to alert you in a way that you maybe would have picked up on in some of this incidental, informal interaction. So we're being more intentional about it. But when people come back and report what happened as a result of intentionally moving towards others in this way, they're like, oh, this started this whole conversation. And they're reporting things that mirror some of that incidental creativity that Robert's talking about. So I think we're going to lose some of it if we're not intentional about how to build in spaces for it going forward. It's a great thought and great question.
Yeah, interesting. So, so in your book, you talk about practicing empathy, and here we're talking about empathy, and you also talk about sort of taking some doable risks. I don't know if this is a part of what you're talking about when you're talking about that, or what is it? What are those doable risks that you allude to in your book?
Yeah, I mean, certainly empathy is a risk, right? It's always a risk because we're opening ourselves up to the experiences and the feelings of others. And sometimes those experiences and feelings may contradict our own experience and feelings. And then we're, kind of in cognitive dissonance and trying to work through that stuff. But in terms of how I talk about it in the book, I actually talk about 4 pretty specific steps. And these are things that came out of the research that we've tested in the Road Ahead groups. And a risk kind of comes on the back of imagination that comes on the back of empathy. So let me describe the 4 steps, and I'll talk a bit more about risk. So the first is practicing empathy along the way, kind of in perhaps in the way I just suggested, or in a way that mirrors the story of the Good Samaritan. And the second is converting empathy into imagination. So it's not enough to sort of say, okay, Maxime, I see you and I feel you and I hear you. It wouldn't be enough if the Good Samaritan was like, oh, that guy over there is having a tough time. Keeps walking, right? Like, wouldn't have been enough. Like, there's this what if questions that can come as a result of empathy. And it's not necessarily always like the story of Good Samaritan where we're like the solver of someone else's problems, but it's like, what if I joined somebody? What if I came alongside them? What if I used the resources already at my disposal? And that guy, in the Samaritan's case, the donkey, a little bit of money and some oil. What if I use the resources already at my disposal to help this person? That's the imagination. But then it's not enough to imagine. It's not really enough to say, what if? There's got to be this, like, let's try this, actually, like, let's do something. And this is where we get into next doable risk. A lot of times people have an adverse relationship with risk because when we think about risk, we tend to think about the big risk, right? We say, like, okay, you got to jump off a cliff with me, or I'm from Nebraska. We say, oh, you got to bet the farm. And that stuff can be scary. That's big. It's like, well, what might it mean to scale that all the way down and think about, okay, well, what's a risk I can take within the next 7 days? What's a risk I can take with the resources I already have, which might not be money, maybe time, maybe relationships, but it just brings it all the way back down into something that actually feels doable. And oh, by the way, when we start taking doable risk, they start stacking up onto one another to really teach us some things and do this iterative work and help us discover what we're passionate about, right? So that's that risk taking that ends up fueling back into those things. So yeah, I like to think a lot about taking next doable risk. I'll give one story of this, and then I'll stop talking. Jessica Jackley is a co-founder of Kiva, and I believe her brother maybe is an alum of Fuller. Is that right? Is that right? I think so. Adam Jackley. Okay, I might be wrong there, but I don't think I am, and I won't try to call out records right now. I talked with Jessica about her work starting Kiva, and I asked her, like, how did you come to start this thing that is now given over $1.4 billion in loans to entrepreneurs around the world, largely in denominations of 25 US dollars. So, whoa, how did you start this giant world-changing thing? She's like, oh, it's kind of by accident, Michaela. I was on a development trip with another organization, out in West Africa, and I was supposed to be there to capture stories that kind of pulled on heartstrings of our donors. She said, but as I was there, that's not what I was encountering. What I was encountering were all these very business minded, very savvy people who just lacked a little bit of money. So right there, she's practicing empathy on the way, right? And so I said to myself, like, what if I took their pictures, wrote up their stories, and emailed my friends and family and saw if they wanted to invest in them, right? Here's the what if questions, the imagination. Okay. She's talking about literally using her resources of writing skills, her camera, and her email list. There's no money involved yet. And so she emails her contact list, and everybody is like, yeah, I want to support that business idea. Yeah, I want to support that business idea. And actually pairing them became that next doable risk for her. And she said, we learned a ton in there. We learned a ton about what worked and what didn't. And we did that. We had to do a bunch of, revising before we were really ready to go public with this. And that learning a ton of stuff is reflecting, right? So it's like we move from empathy to imagination to risk taking to reflection. And this has become a process that first identified in the research, but then we've led 250 people through it now at the Dupree Center. And that has kind of become like second nature to me and my work that really does help us get going on risk when we otherwise might be adverse.
That's so interesting. So, she sort of happened upon it, right?
Mm-hmm.
Because there was empathy and there was that level of risk taking. And in your book, you do talk about sort of the entrepreneurial way. And so, yeah, who would that be for? I mean, she fell into it by accident. People are intentional about going into it. So when you're talking about the entrepreneurial way, to talk to us a little bit about that.
Yeah. So entrepreneur is one of those words where, again, most people are like, not for me, that's not me. Or there's like a small percentage that are like, yeah, I'm an entrepreneur. And so in order to try to, I'm on a one-woman mission to help everybody understand that they have the capacities to be entrepreneurial, even if they never start a formal business. And why is that? Why do I care so much about that? Well, partly because that's my family and where I come from, right? We're all just sort of working out of those systems. But the other reason is because at the very core of what it means to be an entrepreneur is to notice opportunity, to be able to create value in light of risk, right? And so I would love to imagine a world in which many, many, many more Christian people and the church say, hey, we can see needs and we've got resources. We've got proverbial cameras and email lists and writing skills or oil and wine and donkey. We've got some things that we can do to add value, even if we don't quite know how it's all going to turn out, even if we're a little unsure, even if there's some parts of that are scary. So I am increasingly convinced that we should all think of ourselves as entrepreneurs, because I think that we all have value to add, right? In the face of needs in a changing world. And I think that's central to our shared calling to belong to Jesus, quite honestly.
This has been just so wonderful, Michaela. Thank you for all that you shared with us. I would love to open it up to either a question in the chat, a thought in the chat, or yeah.
And looking at our time, I'm guessing we might have time for one question.
Oh, yes.
Ed, certainly I, would welcome, but I also know you might feel sort of on the spot. So even if you've just got a comment or a thought or something that's resonating with you, we certainly would welcome anything you've got.
And I do want to thank you, Michaela. This has been so much to hear and to ponder, very thought-provoking. I can't wait. I can't wait to get the book. And we'll see if we have a question come up. But in the meantime, I do want to let you all know, as promised, we will be giving away 10 copies of the book to the first 50 who registered and who attended today. And we'll randomly draw those 10 names, and we'll let you know who you are. And Michaela, there is a thought here from Debbie.
Yeah. I think Debbie's saying that this whole idea of success and coping, when our definition of success, or even the kingdom's definition of success, doesn't quite match the world's. I think it would be easy to sort of strike the tone of like defiance and say, yeah, like we've got this definition of success as Christians, and we're sort of signed on to God's mission, and feel great about that and feel proud about that. It would be easy for me to suggest that, but the problem is I don't think that's how it plays out most of the time. I think how it plays out, I think it requires the word that Debbie's using, which is cope, because a lot of the decisions we make are quiet, and they're sort of, kind of, especially in our work, maybe behind closed doors, and we can feel lost there, right? We can feel loss, and we can feel the heartache. So I think that the first thing is just to name the difference, just to really name it and bring it up to the surface, because it's there. That sort of larger cultural, I think actually multiple definitions of success are pushing us toward wanting that, and we can't help but sort of want that. So I think naming it, but this is where I think fellowship and believers become really important. And I think one thing that we've heard at the Dupree Center is people are like, I don't have a ton of space to talk about my work in Christian ways. Like I go to church and we talk about life, but we don't always talk about work. So it has been honestly, eye-opening for me over the last several years to realize how much of a need there is for us to talk to one another about our work as Christians. Some of these choices we're making that are more distinct, some of the losses we're feeling because our own definitions of success don't match up. So my encouragement there would be to find people. And, we certainly have some of those resources and avenues available at the Dupree Center, but I wouldn't suggest that, you all don't have your own access to community and even this alumni network. So I think people become really important there.
Absolutely. Absolutely. So we've placed a link there in the chat where you can pre-order your book, and would encourage you to do so. There are many ways that this book can be used. There is just real quickly, a question from someone about a discussion guide for group study, perhaps?
Yeah, actually, we're putting together a conversation primer as part of the pre-order package. So that conversation primer would very naturally double as a group guide. Additionally, there at the end of each of these chapters, there's either a practice or a set of questions that just kind of naturally head in that direction. If the book has them in there, and for anyone who pre-orders, or we can send it out through the people who are going to get the giveaway as well. There's a conversation primer that can help with that.
Great. Well, thank you again, Michaela. This has been so enlightening and so helpful, to think about how empathy plays into the world of work, and how we really are all entrepreneurs on some level, right? And how we deal with the challenges that have been happening for several years. And I know I'm thinking a little bit differently about calling. And so lots and lots and lots, and I'm looking forward to getting from your book. So thank you everyone for joining. We are at the hour, and we hope that you will come back. We've got so many other events planned, so hope that you will join. And stay connected. Stay connected with us, your alumni relations team, and with your fellow alumni, and make your work matter. So have a great rest of the day, everyone. Thank you again, Michaela.
Thank you.
Take care.
Bye.
Bye-bye.